Hello all, I think it's time to go, if that's okay. Hello and welcome to our webinar today. I'm David Clarke and I'm Vice Chairman of the European Movement in Scotland. One of the most important things we do as an organisation is to try and bring information to the people in Scotland about the European project and about various issues related to that. And you know, we all feel that we've been a bit underserved in Britain with the information that we get about Europe, and therefore it's doubly important that we as an organisation bring you this information, and particularly that we talk to the political parties about what their perspectives are on Europe and what their policies are in relation to the EU. And thus we now have this new series, the first of which is tonight, to find out what the political parties, their policies are on Europe so that they can inform all of you. And with that, I'm delighted to be joined today by Sarah Boyack MSP. She's Scottish Labour spokesman on Europe. She also happens to be Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, External Affairs and Culture. I hope I got that right. And she also happens to be an honorary president of the European Movement in Scotland. So we both consider her a good friend, and we also consider this friendship to allow us a wee bit of liberty in probing what the Labour Party's attitude is to Europe. And just a wee bit of biography before we go on. Sarah is no doubt used to the art of compromise. She was born in Glasgow, but brought up in Edinburgh, and she studied modern history and politics at the University of Glasgow. And after that, she worked as a town planner in London before becoming a lecturer at Heriot-Watt University. Notably, she was Scotland's first Transport and Environment Minister in the newly reopened Scottish Parliament in 1999. And since then has been an MSP representing Edinburgh or the Lothians, with a short hiatus between 2016 and 2019. Sarah, thank you very much for joining us. How are you today?
I'm fine, thanks.
I've got to say, we're going to give a special thank you to Keir Starmer for providing us all the material that we need to go through today. But we'll get to that later. I just wanted to ask you first off, in terms of you know, you're a spokesperson on Europe. You've obviously got a keen interest in Europe. Where does that come from? Is that from childhood, from parents, from growing up, from student days? When does that come from?
It's probably in my DNA. And from about the same time, the Labour Party devolution and the European movement are when I first started getting interested in politics. My dad was part of the European movement in the 70s. Even before we joined the European community, and he was active not just in the wider European movement, but he helped set up the Labour campaign for Europe with his friend and fellow member George Fawkes. So I guess that comes from my early days, but it was also, I happened to be at a school in Edinburgh, and we were twinned with schools in Munich and Florence. I lived in the home of the Edinburgh International Festival, and I was always interested both in politics and history. So for me, the whole concept of being European and that being part of who I am, but also it's definitely shaped where I've come from. And doing history, modern history was what I studied. So the relationships, not just in Europe, across the world, but that period from the 1900s was the bit I was most interested in. So not just the First and Second World War, but the aftermath of war and how states work together and how people trade and the relationships. So for me, that is part of what I've always been interested in. And then it feeds into probably inequalities. It feeds into, I've always been interested in climate change before it was a thing. So for me, the links we've got in the UK and with Europe and then wider across the globe, it couldn't be kind of more topical in terms of where we are now. And like everyone I suspect on the call was pretty devastated by the referendum result, but in hindsight, we should have been much more on the case and you know, just thinking about the populism that was promoted. So there's a lot to be, I'm sure you're going to give me loads of questions this evening. But for me, it's where we are now. We should have been able to predict that. If you looked at commentators say that Boris Johnson influenced the Danish referendum on Maastricht in the early 90s. So we should have been learning from then, I think. And I say that as a joke, but that issue about people's relationship with Europe probably wasn't strong enough, and we should have really been on the case with that already.
Well, thank you very much for that. I do want to point out that I'm going to talk to Sarah for just about 20 minutes or so, and then I see there's questions coming in already, and we'll get to your questions, so don't worry that we will get to them. Quickly, before we get onto the hard stuff, do you think there's ever a conflict between being European, Scottish, British?
There shouldn't be. European, Scottish, British, and international, because living between Edinburgh and Glasgow throughout my life, spent a bit of time in Stirling. Different areas have very different perspectives, and we kind of need to get that. For me, there's always going to be trade-offs. Whether you're part of the UK, whether you're part of Europe, and relationships with other countries, and especially for somebody who's been interested in politics forever, we are not all going to agree with each other. But the issue for me is how we work together, whether we are prepared to be cooperative, whether we're prepared to negotiate, and you can get that whether it's in the Scottish Parliament or in our council chambers. There's a point in where we need to be prepared to work together. So it depends where I'm going in the world, whether I'm British, European, or Scottish. And there's other places where you definitely want to say you live in Edinburgh. And I'm kind of joking about that because I don't have just one nationality. There's things I draw from all of that. There's things I'm proud about being part of the UK for. Also proud to be Scottish, but part of being European is also who I am.
Well, with that in mind, and having ascertained, I mean, I don't think that, we could doubt your European credentials. Can you try and encapsulate for me, maybe in about 2 or 3 sentences, what Scottish Labour, and by extension the Labour Party's policy is in relation to Europe?
Absolutely determined to rebuild relations that have been destroyed, damaged, and undermined by the Tories in government, but also how do we deal with Brexit here and now? Our farmers, our industries, people in the hospitality sector, the care sector are all impacted on by the damage that's been done by Brexit. So we need to address that immediately because we're also in a cost of living crisis. But I think for us in Scottish Labour, rebuilding, reconnecting is absolutely central with our European colleagues. And it's something we've been talking about. Just look in the last year or two, Germany's changed leadership. You've now got Olaf Scholz. In Portugal, the Socialist Party got a majority, which many didn't expect. So there'll be those kind of relationships. But I go back to that point, you have to work with people even when you don't agree with them. So I think it's building those relationships, trade reasons, cultural, so this isn't 2 sentences, is it, David? Trade reasons, cultural reasons, education to rebuild after the abolition of the Erasmus scheme in terms of us not being in Europe. And the other thing I would raise that needs to be part of our politics is also climate change at the moment, especially post-COP. Some good relationships built across Europe, but we've actually got to get on with tackling climate change. So on those key kind of areas, I think there's an awful lot that we in Scottish Labour are very keen to keep working across the UK with the other devolved nations in the UK, but also with our partners in Europe. And when I say Europe, I mean both EU and European countries.
Well, I suppose, it's how does that work, really? There's no specifics there, are there? I mean, what does rebuild and reconnect mean?
Well, top priority for us is getting a Labour government elected, because that would give us the means to start doing that. And at the moment, we're the opposition at the UK level, and in the Scottish level, we are trying to get governments to work together. And one of the things that's really striking from being on the Europe committee, the committee that deals with Europe at the moment, is the lack of transparency on some of those issues about how the common frameworks are working, the fact we don't have that intergovernmental work between Scotland and the UK at the moment, never mind Europe. So there's a lot of work that is about short-term stuff, and it is about rebuilding post-COVID. So that would be our top priority. But part of that has to be rebuilding our relationships with European countries as well.
I'm just wondering how that's different from what the Conservative would say. I mean, there's no doubt that the Conservatives, in my opinion, probably use Europe as a way of getting the base up and going, and sometimes picking fights. I mean, I'm sure you wouldn't do that. But how is it any different apart from not picking fights with Europe?
Well, we didn't want to leave in the first place, and we were against leaving Europe. So that's absolutely clear. The point is we lost that referendum collectively. I would say that 30% of the SNP support voted to leave as well, 38% across Scotland. So, this is not we've all got to reflect on that referendum 5 years ago, because I think those of us who are pro-Europe underestimate why there's a hostility. So Erasmus, brilliant. 50% of the population don't go to university, not even going to be at the races there. Issues about trade, making those connections. And we could talk forever about the bus that said, the NHS is going to get hundreds of millions more. Now, we knew that wasn't going to be true, but the point is, we've been through that referendum. So what we've got to do now is, our priority, and my number one priority, would be supporting people through coming out of COVID with a cost of living crisis. But the smart move is to actually think about the other things you do at the same time. So that's why I'm saying the thinking ahead is about the rebuilding of those relationships and actually tackling the mess that Brexit has given us. So that is what's different from the Tories, because A, they don't really get the cost of living crisis, and B, their government went for that referendum and completely lacked the commitment to actually win that referendum. And I'm guessing there'll be people from all parties on this conversation, because the European movement is not a one-party organisation. So that's why I'm saying we all have to learn from this. If I go back to the 70s, when I was a kid interested in politics, the Labour movement was not keen on Europe because it saw Europe as stopping subsidies, it saw it as a free market organisation. Irony of ironies, it was a free market push pulled us out of Europe, when actually we need to have that better relationship. And one of the things in our committee we're looking at the moment is the impact on potential environmental standards, with the push that the Tories have got to have trade with the lowest barriers. And that impacts on workers' rights, impacts on environmental standards. And it's not good for the kind of economy that we want to build, the fairer economy we want to build.
Yeah,
that
I suppose
between us and the Tories.
Yeah, well, I think that's possibly clear, but what's not clear to me, and I suppose to others, is what you mentioned a lot of these things that need to be tackled, and you're absolutely right in that. And not forgetting about looking back, and we can all think that we could all have done better. And I think particularly the European movement, we could have done better in understanding where people were coming from. But surely it's okay to posit that to get rid of the effects of Brexit, there's a very obvious way of getting rid of the effects of Brexit. And I mean, without spelling it out, it's to rejoin the European Union. Is that not the simplest way of getting rid of the effects of Brexit?
Yeah, I have seen the splurge of articles post Keir Starmer's comments this week, but if you actually look at the evidence that we've been taking in our committee, the process of getting to another referendum, the actual holding of a referendum, which is clearly not going to happen anytime soon because we've just had one 5 years ago. But even if you had an independent Scotland, evidence would be that it would still take you years if you wanted to rejoin the EU. So that's why I'm talking about the here and now, because actually that's where people's lives are. It's about the here and now. What I'm saying is somebody who is very committed to Europe and in a party that voted against leaving Europe or leaving the EU, is that we want to use our political energies now to deal with the current crisis we've got, but also to rebuild our relationships with our European partners, both in the EU and those that are not in the EU but are European, like Norway. So, in the committee, I've been very clear that Scotland should make the most of the offices we have across Europe. we should also make the most of the UK offices in Europe, and we should be using our soft power now to rebuild those relations. And that's partly why getting a Labour government at a UK election would help transform those relationships, but nothing's going to happen tomorrow. And that is not something that I feel good about saying, but it's the reality. So we've got to think, where are the powers now? What can we do now? What can we do in my party and opposition to influence decisions that take place now, but also build those relationships? And that's got to be critical.
I understand those points, but I suppose, the Labour Party presumably believes in more equality, ending child poverty, all these things. And just because they aren't going to happen in the next 5 years doesn't mean you say, we think they're a good idea. So can we not do the same with Europe? I mean, nobody's saying you can have a referendum tomorrow, but surely stand up and be like, if you feel strongly about Europe, is to stand up and say, we think it was a mistake. We're not challenging democracy here, but if you're asking us what our opinion is, we believe we should rejoin.
Yeah, well, that's something we're clearly, a debate for us in the Labour Party. But the point I'm making at the moment is that inequality is a now issue, and that there are things that we can do now in terms of building relationships. And I mean, looking at the energy issue, that requires cross-government relations in the UK, but it also requires conversations with the EU as well, and with European members. Looking at the experience in Norway, for example, we've just made the big mistake of seeing the ScotWind contract in Scotland put through by the government, which didn't actually get better financial benefits. And that the SNP have criticised the UK in terms of oil and gas for years and looked to Norway as an inspiration, and there was our opportunity. So that honestly, David, is why I'm talking about the here and now, because day in, day out in Parliament, we can be changing what happens, we can influence what happens, and we can sit down and have those cross-party discussions. And as an opposition, we are putting up constructive suggestions. So that's why I'm saying there's the now, and there's also rebuilding those relationships for the future. And I think that is the best we can do at the moment.
No, I get that, and I think that's very clear. And I'm sure there's no doubt that better relationships do generate good outcomes. But I suppose when your party leader in London says that that there is no case, I think, to use his language, for rejoining the European Union, do you not think maybe that those elsewhere around Europe possibly see the same mood music coming from the Labour leader as they see from the Conservatives, and therefore that undermines the ability of a future Labour government maybe to build those better relations?
No, we're just going to have to disagree on that. He was speaking in the Northeast on the radio, and you can see exactly who he was speaking to. He was focusing on what is the current challenge, and it is that issue that, sure, there was a referendum 5 years ago. His current priorities are rebuilding our communities. So where we are now, that's what we're focusing on in Scotland, and using our soft power both in the UK and in the EU. That's absolutely critical for us. And the relationships is an issue now. I mean, look at the problem we've got in the Irish border, which is worse than we were told it was going to be with the Tories. So I think it's a huge job for the opposition at the UK level to be pushing back really strongly against how Brexit has turned out. We didn't support it, and we've not got what we were promised. We didn't expect to get it. We didn't expect it to be successful, but there's a day-to-day job pushing back against the Conservative government. And I think that's got to be our job. And in Scotland, our job has got to be about how the day-to-day stuff delivers for people as well. So I don't see a conflict there. And that's just where we're going to be for a while, I think.
Okay. I mean, I think, I absolutely hear what you're saying about Keir Starmer speaking in the Northeast. And, I think it's very clear that, politicians do have to address messages to particular audiences. But I suppose, for anybody who's a Labour supporter or anybody looking to support Labour, there's no doubt the majority of your supporters are pro-European. And there's a lot of members of the European movement who are pro-European. Lord Adonis is a member of the Labour Party and pro-European. There's a lot of Labour Party members who are pro-European. So what do they hear when the leader of the Labour Party says that there's no case for rejoining the European Union. And I suppose the reason, I don't want to make this difficult, I just want to know where it goes in policy terms, because that's what we're trying to understand today, is where it goes in policy terms.
Well, I think you go back to the point I made earlier about he's also said that we need to actually tackle the problems that Brexit has created and making that settlement work, because it's clearly not working. It's not what we're promised. And that is why you have to go back to have that discussion with the EU. So the other thing we're talking about, what's next in terms of Erasmus. We're pushing very strongly in Scotland for a replacement Erasmus. Wales has got its replacement in place. And they've also gone further than Erasmus. They've also got their TAFE scheme in place, which is building those relationships now. I mean, for us in Edinburgh, this is going to be the 75th anniversary of the International Festival. So it's a really good opportunity to go back to the next generation, that education. Now, I know I'm not answering the question, or I'm not giving you the answer you want, which is Keir Starmer has said one thing, and I'm saying, we had that referendum 5 years ago. We've now got the major problem since Brexit actually happened. It's taken us 5 years to get here. We've got to deal with it now. And yes, we are still pro-European. It's in our DNA, but we've got to rebuild those relationships. They've been dramatically damaged by Brexit. So that's what we've got. That's the practicalities of what we've got to deal with.
Okay. What then, do you think there's room for Scottish Labour to have a different policy or viewpoint on this to UK Labour, London Labour?
Well, we're absolutely clear that it's our job to represent people in Scotland, and we know that there was a margin in favour of staying in Europe, and people like myself, that's how we voted. So what we have to think about is how we use our position in the Scottish Parliament, how we use our positions in the Labour Party to rebuild and to address those issues. I go back to that earlier point. It wasn't just Labour and Conservative voters voted to leave. There were 30% of the SNP support. So there is something about where power lies, understanding where power lies, and making sure that power is used in people's interests. And that was the communications that we didn't win over that Brexit referendum. So that's a lesson for us now. And for us as Scottish Labour, it is rebuilding our country, creating equality, using the connections we already have with our sister parties across Europe. The other thing we're very keen to do in Scotland is to build the interparliamentary connections with our neighbours. So we've got the links we have with European parliamentarians. We've got links across the UK. And that is the context for future discussions about Europe, rebuilding those relations. Very striking, we had a meeting with David McAllister, who used to be in charge of one of the German regions, was totally in with the Angela Merkel government and is now in opposition. There's something about being in opposition and being in power. Whether you're in power or opposition, you've got to use your influence. And for us, it's about being progressive. It's about using our soft power. And about rebuilding connections. So yeah, that's where Scottish Labour is coming from, because we've got these are our neighbours. We fell out with our neighbours, and we don't want to fall out with our other neighbours. There's a price for that. So that means making the effort to keep those relationships is absolutely central to us.
Just to talk about, no, I don't want to go over Keir Starmer again. I'm going to get to the questions in a second. But, if he is speaking, and you've got to speak to all elements of Labour, what would you say to a Labour voter in Scotland or who voted Labour, who'd always voted Labour all their life, and now it's switched maybe to the SNP because they feel European? They see the SNP says that it wants to rejoin the EU as an independent country, independent Scotland. What do you say to that? Do you just say we're not listening? What do you say?
Oh no, we are listening. And I have to tell you, the people I meet on street stalls and when I'm out canvassing at the moment, they are raising issues. Very few people are raising the Europe issue. Labour voters that went SNP If they've come back to us, it's actually because they're prioritising things like how the NHS is being run, how education is being run. They're worried about their employment. They didn't like how lockdown was run. There's a whole raft of areas. If people who were Labour went SNP are still pro-independence, some of them haven't come back to us, but some of them have. And Europe is not at the front of those discussions. It is the front of the discussions for those of us who are
front of this
interested in
discussion, I
Europe.
suppose. I mean,
That's what I'm saying. It is centre stage for us.
For Labour's, whereas maybe on this call, whatever, who want to know what Labour's doing, who feel passionately about their pro-European credentials. What reassurance can you give them? Because the mood music,
Stay and add your voice to those of us who believe that we are part of Europe in the same way they're part of the UK. But relationships have to change. You know, we're not saying we want to stay in the UK because it's perfect. We have got big ambitions for changing how the UK works. And there were lessons to learn about how our relations with the EU could have been better. I mean, the UK had a very important role in Europe, and they had, we actually had quite a privileged place because, we were able not to go to the Euro when we didn't want to. We were able to negotiate that. So there was a prize lost when we left Europe. And for me, it's all about rebuilding relationships. And that's why staying in the Labour Party for those people is absolutely central to bolster that voice and to support people like myself. And the Scottish Labour Party and us is very keen that we work with our European colleagues. But we are where we are. We lost that referendum 5 years ago, but we will keep rebuilding, and we will keep the relationships don't happen by accident. They have to be built. But at the same time, we've got that cost of living crisis that needs to be addressed. And I suppose the other thing we've got this week is looking at that. We need to be relating with our European colleagues, whether or not we're members, because we've got what's happening in Ukraine. So that global connectivity has got to stay with us. And our values of equality, fairness, justice, all of our relationships have to be built on that, whether it's for trade or whether it's political relationships. And that underpins who we are.
Okay, I just don't want to labour the point there, but you talked about losing the referendum. But of course, the point is in Scotland, 62% of people voted to stay in the EU.
Absolutely. And we're part of the UK, and we also voted to stay in the UK. So if you're on the wrong side in those referendums, it is painful. So the issue for me is how do we work collaboratively and reach out to people and don't avoid the discussion? Not avoid the discussion. I'm just not giving you the answer you would particularly want at this moment.
Well, I don't want any answer at all. I'm going to go to the questions now from the floor. So this is Peter Glissoff says, I was once a Labour member. However, I like proportional representation and the EU and its freedom of movement, neither of which seems to be agreeable with the Labour Party. Would it not be worthwhile for Scottish Labour to consider a policy of rejoining the EU and get rid of first past the post? Okay. That's someone else on the floor, not me.
Yeah, no, well, these are additional issues because we actually had quite a strong debate at our conference in Brighton this year about PR. It's clearly an issue that many members are interested in. I mean, I was actually part of the government in Scotland where we introduced PR for local government. I still have colleagues give me a hard time about that. But we've got a different system in local government from the system we have in the Scottish Parliament. When we set up the Scottish Parliament, it was a PR system, and we looked at the German system that was set up after the war. So yeah, absolutely different systems of voting. And what I would say to Peter is that's an ongoing argument, and better to be in having that argument than outside having a discussion with me. What was the other issue you mentioned there, David? Was it freedom of movement?
I'll get that in a second, because we're all in here. I mean, and the thing is, we're in having a discussion. So what's your personal view on first past the post?
Well, I've just told you what my views were in the Scottish elections and the council elections, where I was very much involved in that. And I've been quite upfront and said we had a discussion at it at the UK Labour conference this year. And there was a majority vote on it. And it's not on my portfolio. I've always been reluctant to go for PR, but I can see the strong arguments when you can see the seats, the manipulation that's currently going on with the Tory government to try and weave themselves a permanent majority. There are different dynamics in it. And it's what I'm saying to Peter is an ongoing debate in the Labour Party. And yes, Peter D said there was a vote against it in 2011, but
that was alternative vote, which I don't think anybody who knows about PR would say it's a PR system.
No, but it was a shift. It was actually quite important at the time because, again, there was a huge number of people who wanted the status quo. So for us to get to that stage, I remember the campaign on that. Most of the voters weren't that interested, actually, again. And I think that's part of our challenge, to get people involved.
Well, isn't that a case, I suppose, though, for leadership then? I mean, like, is to actually say what you strongly believe. If you say people aren't interested in something, maybe as political people, and we're all political people here, it's to lead that discussion and say, this is what I strongly believe in.
Yeah, I've actually told you I don't have a strong preference on it personally. Okay. But I've told you there's a good discussion on the go, because there's different options you could go for, because I did support the alternative vote system that we suggested in 2011, and that's a decade ago now. So a fairer system, absolutely, it's got to be part of it, and it's an ongoing discussion for us.
Okay, this is one that I hope you'll feel that is fairer to you. Keith MacDonald in Glasgow says, in these circumstances, is it really honest to promise easy and quick entry to the EU? So, I mean, I suppose from your point of view, it's all very well these ardent pro-Europeans saying, oh, we've got to join immediately. But your point that you make there, it's just not feasible. It's not realistic. Is that your answer? Maybe I should get you to give your answer to that.
Sorry, what? Because I've answered that a couple of times.
Sorry, it was very long-winded on me. So Keith in Glasgow is saying, in these circumstances, is it really honest to promise easy and quick entry to the EU? So I think this would back up the Labour Party's position of a more nuanced and cautious approach to EU. And I just wanted your comments on that.
Yeah, well, if you look at the evidence of how people get into the EU, it doesn't happen tomorrow. Huge amount of negotiations, and the evidence we got at the Constitution, Europe External Affairs and Culture Committee recently was that the EU accession process for Scotland as an independent state would take between 44 and 78 months, but probably 4 to 5 years from the point of application to the point of accession. So it's not a flick the switch and you're in tomorrow. And in a way, that's why I think we need to be keeping our relationships going, because if we look to the long term and look to the future, if we're not going to be members of the EU in the next 5 years, let's not fall out. Let's actually build relationships so that we at least are in good discussion with them. Okay.
A more challenging question. Your Labour Keir Starmer has committed to make Brexit work. This is from Ian Murray. As a Labour Party politician, can you outline the benefits of Brexit? Are you an adherent of the Bain principle, which seems to infect Scottish politics? I don't understand that second bit there. I'm sorry, that's above my head. But yeah, can you outline the benefits of Brexit, please?
No, I don't think Keir Starmer is saying that it's about the benefits of Brexit. What he's saying is it's been a disaster. So we need to actually get our UK government to start a bit of grown-up politics and actually have the discussions to make the current situation we're in work. So if we're looking at impact on trade, the huge queues of lorries parked in the southeast of England trying to get to France, the red tape people have got to go through, they were all the reasons that we were against Brexit. But the UK government has just not dealt with those issues, and the mess on the Irish border as well. So they're the kind of practical things he's talking about, and also worrying about losing jobs. There's a debate about will it be easier for companies just not to bother to trade with us, and that would be the worst of all outcomes. So it is about getting those trading relationships back on a grown-up approach so that it does not damage our economy, because you've now got a very sharp border. It's about delays, it's about additional costs, and that is having a huge impact in terms of our business community. And in Scotland, small businesses, people like the hospitality sector that are importing food, our agriculture sector that's dealing with exports, these are really important issues. And that's what he's talking about, is dealing with those problems that are potentially going to mean we're going to lose jobs in Scotland and the rest of the UK.
Well, so I suppose, can you give us something then tangible that, I mean, like that to aim for? Because it's quite obvious. I mean, I hope you'd allow me to say you're approaching a gradualist approach to this. I mean, we're not doubting yours or even, you know, many in the Labour Party's commitment to Europe, but I mean, we're looking for something tangible policy-wise. I mean, would you consider, and a lot of our, you know, we've had discussions about whether this is even possible, or were it possible, would you say, well, look, you know, we're not for joining the EU, but we would consider some kind of customs arrangement, some kind of single market arrangement that we could do, you know, when the next Labour government comes in? Is that something tangible that you could look at?
Yeah, well, the kind of things we're talking about at the moment are enabling, when we were in power, I'll give you a very good example. When Jack McConnell was First Minister, we negotiated a deal on the capacity for students who'd come from abroad to stay longer in Scotland and to have visas. We've been arguing for visas that would enable people to come back to Scotland and to be able to work in Scotland. And there's the work I talked about in terms of education. That is absolutely critical. It's not just students going to be able to go to Europe and get that experience. Younger people as well who are not university students being able to do that. Another good example is the work in terms of our academic institutions, our universities, who do fantastic research, to be able to continue the research they are doing with other European academic institutions. So that's a kind of practical example. In terms of visas, it's hugely important for our cultural sector and the hospitality industry, and getting that sorted out would be of a huge benefit. So it wasn't an issue last summer as much as it could have been, because we were closed down for the last 2 summers, so we didn't have the international festival. But going forward, the red tape that a lot of people now have is going to impact on the festival, and it's going to impact on theatres touring or orchestras touring, whether to or from Scotland and the UK. So they'd be the practical kind of things where we need to be doing things now. And that's the kind of stuff that I think I would give you as practical issues, David, that would improve people's lives at the moment.
So practically, so what you're saying then is you want, I mean, if I'm understanding right, you want a more liberal immigration policy to allow the labour market, these people into Scotland. So is that specific for Scotland to have that competency?
Yeah, well, I'm speaking for Scottish Labour, and that's one of the things that we've been looking at is, and we've done it before, as I say, in government. So at the moment, it won't solve the care crisis because we're not paying carers enough and we don't have proper careers for them. But we've clearly lost people in the last couple of years. So there are issues like that that are very practical. And what we've said is we are very keen to work constructively and collaboratively. And we would do that as an opposition. We would do that more so in government. So it's about having a very focused approach to tackle the problems you've got now, but also to start looking to the future.
So that collaboration, I mean, what you're saying is there with the SNP, were to bring forward, or to look to negotiate with the UK government to have some independent immigration policy in Scotland. You would look to support that as a Scottish Labour.
It wouldn't be independent in the sense that it would be part of a UK agreement as to how we would do this. That's the point I'm making. It's about intergovernmental work and not just falling out with each other for the sake of it. It's about being pragmatic and about working together and making sure that our economy is actually supported. And that means governments sitting around the table together.
Okay. How would you try and reciprocate that from a Scottish citizen's point of view?
And you mean exactly?
Well, I suppose, I mean, like, you know, what you're saying is that we could bring, presumably what you're suggesting is that part of this pro-Europeanism, you could bring more European citizens into work in Scotland. Scottish citizens have lost the right to work across the EU. Do you think you'd be able to, do you think you'd be able to, negotiate with Germany and France to have a particular visas for Scottish-based young people to go and work there?
Well, I think we're already looking at what replaces Erasmus. So it is possible to look at arrangements, you know, the new Welsh scheme, the TAFE scheme that they've set up.
Yeah, but leaving aside Erasmus, I mean, which is the thing, you know, what about, you know, just that right to live elsewhere? You're talking, you weren't referring to Erasmus, I assume, or the reciprocation of Erasmus, bringing students back into Scotland. You're talking about allowing Europeans under some kind of Scottish system to come here, more to come here. I'm just wondering what you can do in return for Scottish students and people and young people.
Well, that's the whole point about having these discussions, isn't it? You put things back on the table and you have grown-up discussions between governments, and we're just not having that at the moment.
So but do you think that Scotland could go, well, you know, and this is not an independence, pro-independence, but while part of the UK, the Scottish government could negotiate for Scottish-based young people to have visas to go and work in France? Is that what, you know, I'm trying to find an end result of the connectivity in this discussions.
I'm saying we need to actually think about what we need in Scotland at the moment and actually start looking at what the opportunities are. And I don't think we're doing that at the moment. And
so what do you think?
Partly because the UK and Scottish government just aren't talking to each other.
So what do you think
we're not having that dialogue?
Sorry to interrupt, but what do you think the opportunities are then? Because I think we're talking an awful lot about, you know, and I know it's very understandable that we're talking about, you know, getting on better and doing all this, but the end result of this is what?
It's not just about getting on better, it's about where you've got shared interests. So where you've got shared economic interests, that's where you have the discussion. But at the moment, I go back to the points I made right at the very start. You're dealing with a cost of living crisis, which we need to deal with, but we also need to be having those higher level things to think about as well. And it just in the last few days, there has been a new visa approach that's been announced by the UK government. We're not in Parliament this week, so I haven't looked at the details of it. But you know, there's the opportunity for us to look at what needs to come next. And I think for us in Scotland, it's looking at our economy in Scotland and looking at practically what the priorities would be. And from Scottish Labour's perspective, it is that issue about trade, and it's looking at jobs, and it's looking at, in the long run, things like renewables. What more can we do in renewables? We've just got the Scotland contract. What jobs can we set up in Scotland? What information sharing can we do? You know, Denmark's had a generation of having networks, heat networks. We just don't have them in Scotland. And if we're looking at the next generation to tackle climate change, what are the lessons we can learn from other European states? So they're the kind of practical things you'd be looking to do in terms of dialogue. It's not just being friends for the sake of it, it's looking at core issues and also following up some of the other issues and relationships that were built at COP26. Where is the work that can be done going forward? You know, as we look about what's happening with the North Sea oil and gas, what does a just transition look like there? So sharing those ideas, I think, are absolutely critical.
Okay. I don't think we're finding the specifics there, because I think you're talking about subject areas which are very important, but we're actually not talking on, this is what Labour wants, this is what we think we can achieve from these conversations, this is what we could get. But leaving that aside, I'm going to go to a question here. It's from Vanessa Glynn, who's a member of our committee, and she says, do you have any confidence? I should point out that Vanessa was a senior civil servant. Do you have any confidence that the sort of intra-UK governmental relationship you strive for would be on offer from the Johnson government?
There's been a bit of a shift, interestingly, but it doesn't go anywhere far enough. And the straight answer would be no.
So where's the shift? Sorry, may I ask? Where's the shift?
Well, if you look at the work that's been done, there was a House of Lords report that was done before Christmas from their Constitution Committee that made a radical quite a serious set of changes. There was the Dunlop report, the fact that we had in the last month a new announcement made. What I'm saying is I don't think they go far enough, and I think there's much more we would need to do on that. And it's something in terms of looking at how you make the UK work better. It's reflecting that 22 years on, we've got devolved governments that have got more powers in Scotland, Wales. We've also got Northern Ireland. And it's how you devolve power and how you have intergovernmental relationships that work. But the other bit I would say is also about parliamentarian connections, because there's something about transparency as well. There's an advantage in, you could have intergovernmental stuff where nobody knows what's happening unless you were in the room. So there is something about accountability that is needed. And in a way, that's why I was saying I would like intergovernmental relations within the UK, but also have those links with Europe, but also make them parliamentary as well, so that you can get tough questions asked.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here from David Tam MacDonald. And it says, I'd be interested to know what Labour plan to do about the NI protocol.
Well, if we're back in power, we'd be able to review the situation as it is, when we got back in power. But at the moment, it's just trying to get over the mess that there's been, and a complete breakdown in relationships between the EU and the UK government. So absolutely more work needs to be done on that. But again, I'm our Scottish spokesperson, so our focus is probably less on that. It's much more in terms of what we'd be doing in Scotland, I think.
Okay, well then maybe to make a more Scottish angle, I suppose, one of the arguments was, of course, that Northern Ireland benefits from essentially access to the single market and etc. for goods, and is in this hybrid position. Some people would say, why can't Scotland argue for some hybrid position similar to Northern Ireland? And would you support something like that?
Well, I suppose you have to go back to how do you actually make the deal we've got work better? So there'd be a raft of things you'd maybe want to look at in the future, but it's not something I've personally been working on.
Okay, but is that something that you'd aspire to, that Scottish Labour would aspire to, given the fact that Scotland has, you mentioned the fact that we have a unique situation up here. We've got our own parliament. We have, we run our own affairs within the UK. Is this something that you think would be worth looking at?
Well, I think part of this goes back to borders again. And if you think about it, well, we don't currently have a border between Scotland and England. You've got to think through the implications of all of this stuff. It's not just a flick a switch. You've got to make sure that your solution doesn't actually make things worse.
Okay.
So that's why I'm saying we should be discussing this stuff, but it's not just, you're not just going to make snap decisions and things. I think that dialogue is the key thing, and learning from, because I think even the trade between Northern Ireland and Ireland changed, has been changing over the last couple of years as well. So
it's gone up considerably, and we need to be
so exactly, you need to be looking at that and thinking through the implications of that across the whole of the UK and for Scotland as well.
Well, I think the implications are for Northern Ireland and for the Republic are pretty good from that, but because increased trade is normally a good thing. I'm just looking through the questions here. I just want to give a good a range of the questions for you. Gareth Morgan, can we ask Sarah the direct question? Why does she believe it is more important for Scotland to be in the UK than for Scotland to be in the EU?
Well, I regret us leaving the EU because it's put a really difficult border in place that we didn't have before. And the last thing I want to do is to have yet another border in our country that would make things worse. Because one of the lessons from Brexit is that you can be promised lots of excitement, but the reality check will not be good for your economy. It's not good for social interaction. So for me, it's a choice I wouldn't have wanted, but absolutely, do I want to make it worse? No, definitely not. And that's why I go back to the opening point, which is about building on relationships and making sure that we don't lose all of the relationships we have with our European neighbours. But to make it worse by losing our nearest neighbour, who we share an island with, would just be making it worse, and that's the last place we want to go.
Okay, so you do. So to answer the question, you do think it's more important for Scotland to be in the UK than in the EU?
And it's not a choice you've got at the moment, because as we discussed earlier, it would take you years to get back in, but that would be, you'd still have to have had the whole process of independence, which on the basis of Brexit, I really honestly think the damage that would cause is just something that the benefits you get from being in the UK give you so many of the benefits. The powers we've got now as a parliament compared with what we had in '99 are substantially more. And that's why I think we need a much more collaborative approach, where we stand up for what we want in Scotland. We're part of the UK, we get the benefits of trade with that. But meantime, we've got to start rebuilding those relationships that have been damaged by Brexit. And that's why the soft power, culture, trade, environment, all those links where it matters to people and the human connections, that's what we've got to focus on for the next few years and make that as successful as possible. Because where we're at is not a good place.
Yeah, we're getting near the end here of this. And, I do want to get, understand that we could just, come to some kind of agreement here or where we're at. But it seems to be an ungenerous view would say your party's policy, your policy as enunciated today, is to get on better with Europe. And that's it. Is that fair? Or if it's not, why is that unfair?
I think it's the way you're framing it. It's the policy, the approach is to rebuild relationships. It's not about getting on better. It's about being much more focused than that. And it's about thinking through what our priorities have got to be. I go back to the points that we've not talked about tonight for all sorts of obvious reasons, but if we look at the state of our nation at the moment in Scotland, the impact that the pandemic has had on people, that is what we're putting all our energies into, to be honest, as Scottish Labour. We've got a 10-point plan of action, how we would recover from the pandemic. And that's where we're putting our political energy since the May elections. The discussion we're having tonight is a two-way discussion. I'm telling you what I think, but I'm also sitting here listening and I'm thinking about some of the issues you've raised. I am not equally going to make up policy on the hoof. I will take some of the mood music that I've got from tonight's meeting, and I'll also think about some of the difficult questions where I didn't give you an answer that you were looking for. And I will take that away and reflect on that with colleagues. And I think the issue is it's not about just being friends, it's thinking through where are your shared interests and where are the things that make sense to work together on. And that's where thinking about what your priorities are has to be key for the future. And that's why, I'm not a Labour Party conference. I'm one of our reps, and I'm looking at what my priorities are and thinking about how we work together across the European movement in Scotland, where we've got different parties, and where the areas where we can come together and work in areas where we've got broad agreement, and where do we disagree. And tonight is probably fleshing out some of that for you.
Absolutely. And I want to turn to something really quite positive then in steps along the lines of what you're talking about. So Bill Roger, who is a member of our committee as well, says twinning is a rather neglected backwater of our relationships with Europe. Several of EMiS activists are interested in refreshing that. Any thoughts on how best to go about that? In particular, to your point about when you were growing up, your school's relationships that you had.
That's partly about our education system, and that's partly about a global outlook. So we've spent all of our time tonight talking about Europe, which is obvious given who we are, but there's also wider interconnection with the countries like Malawi, Zambia, Pakistan, where we've got a special relationship in Scotland. Europe has been our core relationship, and that partly comes from the Second World War, partly comes from rebuilding across those areas where we'd fallen out. So for me, it's partly that. It's also partly a global perspective in life. And we're not far away from our European neighbours. So that's where it's worth thinking about, and go back to the culture, the history, making those connections. It's why I quite like the Welsh government's approach, because they're not just doing university students, they are thinking about colleges and schools and training opportunities. So it'd be young people who wouldn't historically have actually got to Erasmus. And that's where the schools, I think, schools are interesting, because the young people, the 16-year-olds, what opportunities have they got? Because Brexit has removed some of them. So what can we rebuild? What opportunities can we, using our powers in the Scottish Parliament and using our influence in the UK state, how can we create some new opportunities there for schools? And some of it will be about spending, some of it's about political interest. When it's about visas, that's about the government. But when it comes down to schools, that's about our local councils. And being really political, if they hadn't been cash-strapped by £1 billion over the last decade, their life would be a bit easier for doing this kind of stuff, because they'll be looking at rebuilding from the pandemic. But actually that New Horizons might be part of that for some of our young people who've been locked down for the last couple of years. The idea of being able to make those connections with other schools in Europe would be good. And we've got some of those connections, but it would be a good opportunity. And now through digital connections, it's much more easy. So you could build the relationships as well as having in-person visits.
Well, I think we're just about out of time here. We're nearly at 6 o'clock. And I want to say thank you very much for sharing the time with us there. You've been really very very patient with my question. And I think from, this is the European cauldron in a way, and we want to probe and find out all your views on Europe. And so I hope we didn't give you too hard a time, but I really do appreciate you talking to us today, Sarah. Thank you very much for that. And good luck with passing back, I think, as you say, the mood music back to Scottish Labour, the Labour Party, to listen maybe to the European side as well as those Labour members who maybe aren't so pro-European. It's just full to me then just to say that we have many more of these. We've got the Conservative Party next, and it's not going to be me, but hopefully somebody else will be just as tough on them. Donald Cameron, their Europe spokesman, will be here on the 10th of March to talk about their European policy, whatever that is. Anyway, thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you to all of you, and hopefully see you again soon.
Cheers. Thanks, David.
Bye-bye.
And thanks for all the questions in the chat. I will take a look at them afterwards. Thank you.